Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people that can better help us understand human risk. Nick Hobson qualifies on several counts. Firstly, he's got a PhD in Behavioural Science. Secondly, he's a B-side practitioner, having set up his own business called The Behaviorist. And thirdly, he's the host of a fabulous B-side podcast called It's All Just a Bunch of BS. Nick invited me onto his podcast, so I thought it would only be right to invite him onto mine. In our discussion, we get to grips with, well, what Nick would obviously call BS. Behavioural science, that is. What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights from a behavioural scientist at the top of his game. And you'll learn some interesting things about the history of the discipline and some thoughts on how to deploy it to solve real-world problems facing business and society. If you like what you hear, then do give Nick's podcast a listen. Links to that are in the show notes. Here then, and for the one and only time on this podcast, is what I can only describe as a bunch of unadulterated BS. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Nick Hobson. So Nick, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me, Christian. Great to be here.
You were kind enough to invite me onto yours, so I felt in the spirit of reciprocity that I would have you and in front of my audience as well, because I think we're going to have some interesting things to talk about. Perhaps to kick us off, can you talk about how how did you get interested in behavioral science and what are the areas that you've specialized in?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, if you didn't invite me, I think that would end our friendship right then and there, right? if the reciprocation wasn't offered. So. But glad you did. So we're building a strong sense of trust between the two of us. So yeah, behavioral science. I was a master's student and then PhD student in theoretical social psychology and social neuroscience. And I started at that stage. My research was on the psychology and the neuroscience of religion and ritual, actually. And then broadly from that, I was interested in collective emotions and emotional states of groups and group dynamics and group decision making. So all sort of like very much steeped in, my training was very much steeped in classic social psychology, very theoretical, very basic research, which is sort of on the opposite continuum of applied, which is outside of the zone of what I do now, which is more applied behavioral science. And behavioral science, social psychology, tomato, we ended up sort of our field going with behavioral science, and we can touch on that, why I think that's an important from a branding exercise. But about halfway through my PhD, I started to collaborate with some business school folks. So it was basically like social psychologists who left the psychology departments and ended up going into these big name business schools. And so a lot of what the work they were doing was applying behavioral science or social psychological principles to a target audience of either employees, leaders, or consumers and users. So you can see it quickly takes a bit more of an applied or practical bent. And so when I was exposed to that, working with Mike Norton and Francesca Gino and a few others who were closely affiliated with Harvard's Behavioral Insights Group, or BIG. And BIG was an official partnership, unofficial partnership with BIT, Big and BIT, and this was in about 2013. So, shortly after BIT established itself in the UK, and nudge units were cropping up all over the world. It was my first exposure to behavioral to sort of the behavioral economics, the behavioral revolution. And so I decided that I was going to finish my PhD and publish and write and do all that stuff as a graduate student and as a scientist, but that I would be focusing my efforts on applied behavioral science or applied social psychology, as opposed to following the sort of like your classic professor academia route, which is fine. It's just, it wasn't for me. I'm a bit too social, I guess, for that and normal. So I did that, and then my first first job outside of academia was classic management consulting and human capital, person capital consulting with KPMG. And then after that, went to help build a startup more on the behavior change product design side of things. And then all of these pieces were coming together, and all of that led to my company now, The Behaviorist. And so I decided, you know what, I want to do my own thing. I sort of always had this entrepreneurial drive, and I had a bit of the risk for it, a bit of the stomach for it. And so that's what I decided a couple of years ago to launch The Behaviorist, and shortly thereafter launched the podcast. And as you know, and we can talk about this, sort of my mission is really to break down the wall between my past life, which is the academy and academia, and my sort of current life, which is it's applied behavioral science in the wild, as they say. Is that a good answer to start us off?
That is a great answer. Let's just start with that branding piece that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And actually brings us nicely to the title of your podcast, right? Which plays with, I've always been really careful to avoid abbreviating behavioral science to BS. And so I came up with this BSci sort of attempt to kind of bridge that gap of having something that was short and snappy enough that avoided the challenge. And with your podcast, you just went headfirst in and went, I'm just going to call it that. It's all just a load of BS. And I kind of love that. Let's tackle both of those two things sort of together. Clearly, you don't think it's a load of BS, nor do I. But you know, as you talk to people, you know, branding is important, as you say. Why do you think having behavioral science is important, and why isn't it BS?
So it follows. This is my read of it. It follows, and this is actually sort of a phenomenon that we see is what's happening in practice now with our field is following the similar trajectory of what happened in the science decades ago. So if you know, in psychology or behavioral science, if you want to call it that, is still very new. It's only about 100 and 120 years old as a field in itself. We moved out of like the psychoanalytic tradition of Freud and Jung, which was totally unscientific, interesting for sure, but mostly unscientific and sort of
mildly insane from some of the bits I've seen. I mean,
yeah,
sort of
exactly.
stuff you would not be allowed to get away with nowadays for very good reason.
Exactly. And yet, as a bit of a tangent here, which I'm prone to, and yet when you probe any layperson about like, oh, what is psychology? It's like, oh, Freud. That's like, great. Oh, that's the one thing that you remember of our field is the one thing that was like the least scientific, which is hilarious, but that's another thing. So we went from Freud, and then we quickly moved into the behaviorist tradition, and this is the inspiration for my brand and for my company. And you had these folks like Watson and most notably B.F. Skinner. And these folks were saying, we are hardcore scientists. We want to be scientists. We want to be in the same room as the chemists and the biologists and the physicists. We don't want to be in the same room as the sociologists, the philosophers, the religious scholars. We want to be, yes, we're asking similar questions as them, but we want to apply the scientific method to what we do. And so what that meant was, okay, how do we do that? Like, what does that practice actually look like? And of course, science is all about measurement and operationalization of variables. That's it, in a word. And so our defining and operationalizing of variables can either be mental, psychological properties, thoughts, cognitions, emotions, introspective processes of how a person feels, what they think, et cetera, or it can be more of a objectively observable output, i.e. a behavior. And so the behaviorists were on a good point with this, where they said, forget all of that stuff that we think is happening in here. If we can't observe it, we can't measure it and we can't define it, and it has no room in our science. And they were very dogmatic about that. I'd say they were a little bit too dogmatic in that sense. But that's what they did. They ignored everything that was happening in terms of like that black box. And so our science at that point, from like, say, the 30s, 40s, 50s in the 20th century, was called behavioral science or behavioral psychology or the behavioral tradition. And those people who were doing that work were called behaviorists. So that bode well for us, because we were trying to prove to the world and to other scientists that we were honest to God good scientists, and that we weren't dabbling in this sort of like fluffy shit that Freud was doing. So it was really like them trying to like push away, from the founding fathers. And then the cognitive revolution came in the 60s and 70s, and with Noam Chomsky and others, they were saying we can't ignore the inner processes, because those are the inputs, those are the processes and the mechanics. That is like the physics of our mind, which generates the output that is behavior. And so you can't just divorce those two components of our doing and being. So they did that by first coming up with really elegant and simple ways to measure those processes, so that they could convince. This was sort of like the paradigmatic shift in science and in psychology. They said, we have to care about these things, and we're going to show you, behaviorists, that you can still care about these things and look at these things and do it in a very scientific way. So they came up with sort of like reaction time measures, very clearly define these things, had clear modes of operationalization, came up with systems of memory and perception and cognition and attention, these very like low level things. And that was the time when social psychologists, so my people, were like, if we're as a field, if we're caring about the low level things like perception and cognition and attention, what about all the other things that people are doing? What about all of the other ways that we act, how we make decisions, how we interact with others, the relationships that we form, the religions that we engage in, the cultural practices, like the things that are so important for understanding basic, fundamental human nature? What about those things? And so that's when social psychology came onto the scene, and the social psychologists said, we can also be scientists. We're going to borrow the methods from the cognitive scientists, but just ask it in a little bit of a different way. Now, they kind of screwed up, and that has also led to the replication crisis that we're seeing in psychology, where social psychologists are probably the worst, they're the worst off for that. And I swear this is coming to a close at some point. This is a long answer history lesson for you. I hope I haven't lost your listeners. And so then the 90s and the 2000s brought neuroscience. And that really established the fact that we could peer inside here. Not only were we inferring or reifying these abstract states, we could look at a brain scan, we could look at an electroencephalographic graph and say, this is a brain process. This is a region of activation in the brain, and that's associated with this particular thought, emotion, or behavior. So it gave a sense of legitimacy, and then there's all this like neuroscience hype, et cetera, et cetera. And then that brings us to 2008, 2009 with the onset of the behavioral revolution. And I think, we ended up going with behavioral as opposed to psychological, because similar to how the behaviorists did it back in the 30s, we as practitioners were saying we need to convince policy officials and decision makers, and now we need to also convince executives and leaders who don't have that science background that we're legitimate, that what we're doing brings and adds value and is important, and that they need to give us mandate and budget to do the work that we want to do. And if we came to them and said, we're professional psychologists, we can do this, I don't think we would have seen the success or the uptick that we've seen. So the opposite to that is we're behavioral scientists or behavioral economists, which is the added sort of layer of legitimacy. We dabble in behaviors because we can observe them, because we can measure them. We run tests, we run experiments and randomized controlled trials. So I think it was just a very smart branding for the early Thaler's and Sunsteins and Ariely's and the like, to say, let's focus on the directly observable phenomena, the behaviors as the outputs, and not put so much emphasis on the psychological. Even though a lot of the work that we do is highly psychological, and it could be just as well be psychological science instead of behavioral science.
Wow. I learned some stuff there. So even if the listeners knew all that stuff already, I certainly learned some things. So thank you for that. But if we look at that and just go, okay, there's a sort of scientific discipline there. And yet it comes in for a lot of criticism. There are people who go, it's kind of fluffy mumbo jumbo, and there's a whole load of other pieces. And we've seen some examples recently to bring the conversation to the interesting topic of the moment, where behavioral science is being deployed to influence sets of people, populations, to behave in a certain way, and that's not always perceived positively.
Yes. Yeah. So this is also an important distinction, which draws a line between academic behavioral scientists and behavioral practitioners or applied behavioral scientists, is what I call the prescriptive versus the descriptive. So in my training, and this has always been the case for a majority of psychologists and behavioral scientists, we are not, like when I say we, I mean the academics. The academics are not in the game of telling people what to do. That has always been the case for the longest period of time, for decades. We're in the game of observing and describing. So that's the descriptive tone of human psychological behavioral science. We're even how we communicate our findings, how we design our studies, how we go to conferences and tell people about our findings. We're very, very, very careful not to enter into the prescriptive zone, which is, this is what I know about you, and this is what I'm going to tell you what to do. And that's what behavioral change is. That's what sort of what we do. As I'm using we in two ways. When I say we now, I'm referring to behavioral practitioners. We're in the game of prescription. We're prescribing little, doses of behavior change insights to get a user to do this, to click this button, to get a customer to buy this product, to get an employee to behave, or a leader to behave this way, sort of like, it's nudge, it's choice architecture. It's frame the situation and the scenario to orient the person's attention to this desirable outcome or option, as opposed to the default. Choose the apple over the sweets or the cake or what have you. We're in that now. We're in a different game. We've moved from describing to prescribing. And to be honest, part of the reason why I think there's such a wall between academics and practitioners is because we haven't sorted that out. And we need to sort of ask ourselves, what do we do? Do we describe or do we prescribe? We do both, I think, but we sort of have to build a little clarity around that.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it, because basically if I take the story that you outlined and the way you've just depicted it is in essence, if this were medicine, where you've got academia has done some research into something, we know that certain drugs operate in a certain way on the body. And then we regulate that stuff. Whereas we're doing a similar kind of thing, which is we're not sort of physically touching people, but we are messing with their minds, if you want to be cynical about it, or influencing them, if I'm going to be positive. And that's not regulated, which is kind of interesting, right? Because it's the same thing. It's taking academia's findings and going, how can I, use this on people? And of course, the criticisms of behavioral science is all around manipulation, and we're sort of restricting people's choices. And that leads you into the territory of, shouldn't this stuff be regulated?
Exactly. And that gets to this question of ethics and Sunstein's libertarian paternalism. And is it behavior change for good? That's the question, and I don't think we have good answers for that. I think I do believe I'm thrilled that our field is doing what it's doing. I'm thrilled that the walls are slowly coming down, that people are showing an interest. But holy shit, we have a lot of work to do, and one of the biggest jobs for us in the next decade is building some oversight and some regulatory body. Exactly as you say, if we have colleges and we have these organizations that serve to standardize and demonstrate the ethical principles of physicians and pharmacists and drugs, why should we not have the exact same things in place for our field of professionals? And along, related to that in the same vein, how do we regulate the people who are doing that work? Right? Like, who do we call a behavioral practitioner professional? You could take a Coursera course on decision-making and biases and heuristics, and all of a sudden you label yourself as a professional. And two things: that dilutes the talent of our field. And I don't want to sound like, oh, a PhD, like I know more. I don't. I think some of the best people I've had on the podcast, yourself, don't have that training. I think the people who have like the real world training of behavioral science often have the best insights. So I don't think it's an obvious answer. I don't think it's you need a PhD. In fact, I would probably want to stay away from that. But there is still the risk of talent, of diluting our talent, the talent pool of our professional body, and it leading to sort of like, people doing more sinister work and having a bad name for our field, like, i.e. Cambridge Analytica and dark patterns on the web and these things. So there needs to be some regulation if we're gonna build a sustainable professional practice that is seen as good, as ethical, and scientific. We need that.
I mean, there's an interesting counter argument, right, which says that the reason you regulate drugs and these sorts of things is because they can have a major impact, and it is not possible for people generally at home to make their own, right? There are sort of old recipes that come back from way back when, and we sort of herbal prescriptions that you could try out yourself, but you can't generally as an individual access the raw materials to make some of these high-powered drugs, right? And without great effort. And we regulate the supply of the ingredient. Whereas if you look at behavioral interventions, every single one of us all of the time, whether we know it or not, is deploying behavioral science in some way, shape, or form. Now, we might be doing it unknowingly, we might be doing it badly, but it's a tool that we all have. And you've got a kid, whether or not you'll be using those techniques all the time, and that's that stuff that you've picked up. Sure, I'm sure you'll be deploying your academic prowess in that field, but there will also be situations that you're just relying on as a human being who's had experience of life. And you'll be falling back on that. So the counter argument would be everybody's using this all the time. We're all subject to the influence. And where would you stop? Because advertisers use this stuff. Even someone just crafting an email is using behavioral science in some way, shape, or form, or at least aspects of it. And so it'd be hard to know where you draw the line there.
That is a great counter argument, and I don't have a good rebuttal or a counter to that, because you're right. We, unlike drugs, we sort of behave and make decisions and act and send emails and have conversations all the time. And so what would be considered necessary to regulate and what wouldn't? Maybe it's like if you are whether in policy or in private for profit, or if you're trying to influence maybe a certain number of people, maybe it's a threshold for the number of people who are receiving that intervention, then there needs to be some regulation. Or if it's in the for profit, if you're commercializing in any way, then maybe there needs to be some sort of regulatory guidance. But great point. It's and there's a famous quote from George Miller, who was in the 60s, the American Psychological Association president. He was like a cognitive scientist guy, I think. He would say, our duty as psychologists and academic psychologists and behavioral scientists is to give psychology away. We can't be in our ivory tower gleaning all of these amazing insights about human nature and human beings and behavior and just keep them to ourselves. That would be such a tragedy and such a terrible thing for humanity. So we need to take these insights and to disseminate that knowledge and to disseminate that information so that people can craft an email, have a conversation with a spouse, parent a child, deal with an anxious or a stressful situation in a way that is, quote unquote, behaviorally or psychologically informed. And in effort to improve the well-being of as many people as possible. And if we're doing that, back to your point, well, you're not going to regulate that. That should be sort of just accessible and available to all, right?
Right. And I think there's something interesting, and it was triggered by your comment around religions earlier. Not that I think behavioral science is one of them. There are elements of the field where it does feel a little bit like that. Yeah. But if I look at, one of the most powerful things I think that is missing from the average person's toolkit at the moment is critical thinking. and an ability to understand some of the things that are going on. And so to look at, who am I listening to? What are they up to? Why are they trying to tell me this thing? What information do I not possess? Am I taking cues from the wrong people? Mm-hmm. Am I misunderstanding? All of these sorts of things that we use to navigate when, for example, we go to a foreign country and we don't know how to behave, and we're picking up cues to allow us to try and fit in and navigate that world. And so I see critical thinking as a piece that's missing. And I think one of the interesting things that behavioral science could start to do would be if we can get people to understand the sorts of things that influence their own behavior and their own decision making, we can try and start to teach critical thinking so that they don't just sit in front of pick your TV station and assume that every single thing they're being told is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That they can start to challenge some of there's the sort of questioning of advertising. Is what they're telling me the truth here? The simpler. But then there's the really dangerous stuff, which leads to conspiracy theories. I mean, we've had people in the UK burning down 5G towers because 5G causes coronavirus. Yeah. And it's so absurd. But this stuff perpetuates, and this is causing real problems, and it's an issue nowadays because people are burning stuff down that's stopping the emergency services from communicating, right? It's just serious stuff in the current climate. Mm-hmm. And so I see this as we could potentially use this as a tool for good and try and help people, almost de-radicalize some people who are not capable because they haven't been taught of thinking critically.
Yeah. It's interesting. So a preprint just came up from my colleagues, Nate Barr and Kelly Peters. They're at BE Works with Dan Ariely. And they found a couple weeks ago, I mean, they put this paper together so quickly, it's amazing, that you can measure, in terms of individual differences in personality, you can measure a person's likelihood of being more of an analytic thinker versus what they call like an intuitive type thinker. And we know from past research that analytic thinkers tend to be scientists, obviously. They also tend to be less likely to be religious. So there's more atheists are analytic type thinkers versus theists or devout religious people are sort of more intuitive style thinkers. And all sorts of other different outcomes associated with this individual difference trait. But what they found in the context of COVID-19 is that people who are more intuitive style thinkers or less analytic are more likely to be sort of the conspiracy theorists and believe that coronavirus is a hoax, a play of the Democrats or whatever their chosen conspiracy theory may be. So to your point, to your question, yes, I think that is so important. Recognizing that it is an individual difference and that there's going to be some people who will just self-select into that type of analytic thinking, like myself, like yourself, like anyone who's probably a behavioral practitioner is more. But then what does that mean for, like, maybe that's a biased way of thinking about the world. And I'm just sort of checking my own self right now.
Right.
If you go to an artist who like a painter or a musician, for instance, and I play some music. And so when I do play music, I'm not the scientist. I'm not Nick scientist. I'm like the groovy, cool artist Nick, who's, playing guitar. You don't necessarily want that analytic mindset when you're creating art. And so I don't, as much as I love analysis and the analytic mindset and scientific critical thinking, I think there's a time and place for it. And maybe when we're trying to navigate the craziness of a global pandemic, that's probably a good time to adopt the analytic mindset and to sort of frame switch and to turn it on. But I think it's tough because we have to recognize that not all people are going to be on that side of the normal curve. And there's going to be a huge resistance to even training oneself or reading books and learning about it. And we do know that as well. There's a lot of people who have this sort of resistance to science, and they think that science is devious and it's doing more harm than good. A lot of like the climate science deniers are in that camp. So there's a fear of science as well.
I think that's fascinating because as you were talking, and this is why I love these conversations, because it's pausing me to think about stuff. And, as you were talking, I start from the premise that, look, we need human risk is all around stopping bad things from happening because people do things that we don't want them to do, right? So I'm trying to control and I can explain it positively by saying I'm stopping bad things from happening. I'm protecting people. I'm protecting society, doing the right thing. But you're absolutely right. If you take that to its logical extremity, the human risk piece stops kind of human reward, the positive aspects that we get from that. And the way that, creative solutions are found by people doing things that don't necessarily fit the traditional norms, and amazing, medicinal discoveries, amazing bits of music. Just incredible things have happened because people have been allowed to just let loose on their kind of creative side and just sort of think outside the box and to do some things that are not necessarily logical, that are sort of the essence of being human. Is you'll produce things the machines, they can mathematically produce stuff, but we'll get there in interesting ways and so I think there is something interesting in what you say around as giving me pause for thought around the human risk piece of saying, at what point do we stop controlling people, and how, when should we just let people think freely and do what they want to do? Because that's when, arguably, as species, we're at our worst, but we're also potentially at our best. And I'm struck around the education system where we start off with kids in kindergarten and we let them run around and do what the hell they want. Right? And it's creative, and you can, and little Johnny who paints on the wall gets told off, but it's kind of cute. And then you go through that phase and we stop that. And then we put you in seats, in rows, and we teach in a very linear fashion where, you're learning geography, and then you do history, and then you do languages, maybe. And of course, as if those things operate in isolation.
Yeah.
And the world doesn't work in the way that academic streams. And so I wonder whether we've lost a little bit of this thing where we start education really interestingly, bringing out these aspects of human dynamics, and then we stamp it out of people as we have a more ordered structure. And I can't help wondering whether we've sort of, defeated ourselves in a way by presenting the world in a very, it's convenient for the academic establishment to have, here's a geography lesson, here's a history lesson, but we don't necessarily pull those threads together.
Mm-hmm. And to pull it back into like our field, I think we have to be careful to over science it, if that's a verb.
It is now.
Trademark. Because I know a lot of scientists, and there's actually sort of two types, and these are all normally distributed. I recognize that, people, but if you will allow me to sort of bin them into two categories, there's the scientist who's a fantastic empiricist, and those are like your highly analytic thinkers, very logical. And then you have the more conceptual, theoretical, creative scientists. They're not out there. They're not woo-woo. They're still a scientist, but they're so creative in drawing on parallels or disparate lines of research and consolidating them and pulling them together in a very creative way. To draw the analogy, it's almost as if they're writing a piece of music or drawing a painting. But they're doing it with science. They're doing it with data, with evidence, with theory. So it's almost like this. You can. So my point is, in short, you can do science, but in a very creative, almost intuitive way. And that's maybe that's an oxymoron. And I'm just totally riffing right now. I'm speculating. I don't know if there's any evidence to support this. But maybe there's still room for us to build the credibility of our field as scientists and evidence-backed and empirically grounded, but in a way that's still playful and flexible and creative, so that we're not just saying we are logical, we collect data, we do this. I think we can still be highly creative. And that's, I've brought this up on my show often, is like, what's the difference between a behavioral designer and a behavioral scientist and a behavioral economist, hence the name of the show, is maybe when it comes to the behavioral design folks, which are usually more on like product design and reside in Silicon Valley, maybe they're keeping a lid on our sort of like dogmatic scientific approach and saying, chill guys, like we can be creative about this. We can be playful with it. And that's a good thing, I think.
And look, speaking of the podcast, just let's talk a little bit about that. Because, one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the show was to talk about that, because I, one, want to make sure my listeners are aware of its existence. Very important. But the second piece is to sort of explore, what did you set out to do in creating the podcast, and what have you learned whilst doing it?
Good question. So in the summer, almost a year ago, I had this idea, like I was building the brand of The Behaviorist, and I've always been an avid podcast listener. And I knew there was some out there. When I should pause. When did you launch yours? Maybe we launched around the same time.
October.
So yeah, geez, wow, it's the exact same. So I don't think yours. I wasn't aware of yours or your work, but there was Behavioral Grooves, and there was a few others, Ogilvy, Action Design Network, Stu King's as well. So I knew they were out there, and so I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go out and like create this amazing podcast that hasn't been done before. Like I wasn't that naive or narcissistic. I saw that maybe what I saw was an opportunity to have conversations with people. And like you said earlier, it is just such a tremendous, like as we're doing right now, I'm learning a lot. I'm learning more in this 1 hour session, and hopefully vice versa for you than I will all week. And that's just because of like just riffing off of like really cool big ideas. And
it's either a damning indictment of your week, or I'll take that as a positive thing. We'll go with the latter.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So that was really the MO. And to be totally pragmatic, it was also just a piece of like content marketing for the business, and to get my name and my work out there. And then I'd say the third thing was my attempt to bring academics with practitioners. So the guests that I have on the show it's quite a range, and I do that intentionally, because I don't want us to limit ourselves to like a behavioral practitioner is this person. It's like, no, they can exist in a university, they can exist in a hospital, they can exist in a startup with designing apps and designing products. They can exist in corporations, like you name it, right? And so I'm really trying to pull all different sides in one place. So that was the third reason for doing it. Did you have another question? I can't remember now.
I did, which is I'm always intrigued, and I view this the question I'm about to ask you should always be viewed in the context of one of those alien movies, where they come in and they try and suck up the sum totality of human knowledge and then go off somewhere else. And the purpose of arriving on Earth is, so I always view my discussions with other podcasters a little bit around that, of saying we can distill down, and obviously everybody should listen to every single episode that you've done. But I wondered what the sort of key pieces you'd learned from the conversations that you've had around human behavior, things that surprised you, things that might be interesting from a human risk perspective.
Great question. Just to think back, I would say, okay, so first, and maybe I'll add to maybe I'll make it 3 as I'm trying to think off the top of my head. But first is, we can do science in the wild. So the misconception from a lot of people and a lot of academics is that the only and best way to do science and to understand human behavior and human risk is to run these controlled laboratory randomized control trials or experiments. And that's simply not true. With all of the available technologies, with all of the economies of scale that different organizations and businesses have now, we can be very agile in designing, coming up with hypotheses, theoretically informed hypotheses, designing experiments, analyzing the data, and iterating and updating based on the results we find. You can do that in practice, in whether it's policy or whether it's in a company. You can do that in a way that is so much more efficient than in academia. So, for example, one of my clients, they will put something up online, like say an HBR piece, or some piece of content where they link to one of their products, or they link to a survey, and it's just gathering data. right? And of course, in order to do our science, in order to do our work, we need data. They are able to get those data and therefore glean whatever relevant insights from that in a week. That would take a graduate student 5 friggin' years to get a PhD to do that type of research. So there's just the access and the availability of data in practice is so much more than in academia. So I'd say that's the biggest one, is we can do science in the wild. And not just that, we can actually do it better. Second, and related to the first, is we shouldn't be so siloed in our thinking. And I think we should take lessons from academia of what they did wrong. I think what they did is they sort of have the umbrella category of psychology, behavioral science, and then under that they have, your sub-disciplines. And I understand why they did that. But within those sub-disciplines, you have your own conferences, you have your own conversations, you have your own journals, you have your own media pieces that are publicizing and talking about that research. You have your different target audiences. I think that's such a disservice to understanding human behavior and human nature writ large. So I think what we need to do as practitioners is make sure we're not building those silos and breaking down the walls between the different sub-disciplines. So that would be, behavioral practitioners in policy talking to, the behavioral designers in product, talking to the healthcare behavioral practitioners who are designing healthcare services and products to improve, medication adherence. Like, there's certain universal principles of human nature that cut across all of these different lines and all of these different verticals. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of maintaining that. So I just hope that sort of moving forward. And so that's what I've learned just having these different conversations with folks is people are people, whether it's a customer, a citizen, a user, a spouse, a parent, and they're prey. They will fall prey to the same sort of heuristics and biases. And so I think just remembering that will be good for our field. So that's what I'd say the two most I've learned.
And I find it really interesting. So for listeners not familiar with the concept of replication crisis, there is this thing going on in science at the moment where studies were launched, they made a discovery, and then somebody's tried to replicate it and has failed to do it. And part of me just goes, well, one, the world's moved on. But two, if you get a bunch of people that you've paid, students in a room, then perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that when you're paying those students to be in that room, that doesn't replicate in a different scenario. So I sort of look at this whole idea of replication crisis and whatever as being it's a function of the fact that we're dealing with people, and that sometimes things that work once may not work again. And as you say, I think it's really interesting when we look at something like Amazon. And I could mention Facebook, but let's steer clear of that because that has other nuances. But both of those organizations are constantly running experiments. Mm-hmm. Literally, we are all guinea pigs in their experimentation thing, and they can switch stuff on and switch stuff off and try it. And so their business model is built around that stuff. And if something's not working, we switch it off. And if it's working really well, we just double down and roll it out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting example. And you're right, the historic model of we must test these things in the laboratory, which is what you do back to the drugs, right? You sure as hell can't do that. Let's conduct a chemical experiment or a biological experiment in the outside world, because you get interesting outcomes, right? And I know there's a lot of conspiracy theory around coronavirus, and was that something that was released from a lab? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go there. I'm not endorsing that theory. But I think there's something interesting that sort of says, you're right, the wherewithal to do these things is not just restricted to academic institutions. It's available to organize. And even if you're not you don't consider yourself to be a data-rich environment, I see it. I go around when I'm allowed out, and of course, listeners, I'm staying in and being good. But, I can go to a small store around the corner. He or she who runs the store will be deploying these techniques all the time. They'll be moving stock around, recognizing that something's not selling if they have it in a particular thing, but if they move it around and put it somewhere else, suddenly it starts selling. Or, the price is wrong and they've mispriced something. So they're doing this stuff the whole time. And I think it's really interesting. We associate that with data. But actually, we can do it very, very small things and interventions in our own lives. But even in businesses where you don't necessarily sit on a big data warehouse, you can conduct experiments and immediately implement them. Mm. And that, I think, is quite exciting and interesting. And I love that sort of democratization of science. Again, it's something we encourage kids to play with this stuff.
Yes.
We encourage them to grow plants and to see what happens.
Yes.
And of course, you don't want them doing that with electricity, as an example. And there are certain chemical products in the household that you want to make sure they can't get their hands on.
Yeah.
But there's other things where, just try stuff out, see what works, see what doesn't. We all do this in our day-to-day interaction. So I think it's a really healthy, positive point to say, actually, this is available to everybody. And we should all kind of have a go and feel comfortable trying it without the constraints of sort of being a scientific field. Clearly, if you want to be talking about it as an expert, you need something to support that. Mm-hmm. But I think there's some quick and dirty solutions to problems that you can just try out.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're all, like you said, like from young age, we're all hypothesizers, and we hypothesis test in our natural environment. My 2-year-old does it all the time. She takes a ball and drops it from height 1 versus height 2 and then observes a difference and is astounded by that. And she will adjust her behavior, her subsequent actions as a result of the data, the evidence she's observed. And she does that without any instruction from me. And back to your point about schooling, sort of like ripping that out of our children. I think that's true. So I think it's just like recognizing that we have that within us, that we're driven to do that, and then of course building the structure around that so that it's formalized and done in the best way possible. But one thing that a past guest, one of the earlier guests, Dilip Soman, who is also at the University of Toronto in Rotman, where I did my PhD, and big name in the behavioral economics field, he said there's a large difference between data and evidence. Everyone has data now, especially if you're a big organization with tech involved in something. You're gathering data all the time, and so that's data, and then evidence is the story you tell from that data. But the story that you need to be able to tell and what you focus on in that massive spreadsheet has to have some constraints, and those constraints are going to come from the theory, from the understanding of human psychology and human behavior. And that's often a response I give to people who are like, what is behavioral science anyway? We got the data. We just need to analyze it with like someone who knows machine learning or AI. And that's what I say is, like, you could have the best algorithms, but if you don't have the rich understanding of our century of human psychology and human behavior as a science, then you're throwing spaghetti at a wall and trying to see what sticks. And as a result of that, you're wasting money and you're wasting resources. So why not have an in-house resident behavioral scientist who can tell you where to go first based on what they know of the field?
I love that spaghetti at the wall analogy. I use a slightly ruder one. I will now reflect and shift and borrow your spaghetti one, because the analogy I use is less appropriate. So that's and I was also thinking, your daughter is going to be amazing at beer pong. So even if that discovery takes her no further, that's student life equipped.
If she's probably part of it. If she's my daughter, if genetics has anything to do with it, of course she's going to be amazing at beer pong.
Awesome. Look, a final question for you, which is something you ask all of your guests, and I thought it would be appropriate to ask you. And I'm going to embarrass myself now by forgetting what the initials stand for, but you have this thing called the BBB, which you can remind me what it stands for.
Big Behavioral Brainstorm.
That's the one. And basically, so the basic idea of the question is, what can we use behavioral science to do? Where's the number one application that we could use this for? And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer the question you ask everyone else.
Oh, wow. Love it. That's so good. And I'm going to try not to cheat, because I have 30 or so responses cataloged in my brain from past guests.
We can check. And one of the things my listeners will be doing as they listen to your podcast is going through and checking this, and you'll be reported on if you do that. So this needs to be original.
Oh boy. Okay. So I'm not going to go with any of the obvious of ones, and I'm definitely going to steer clear of coronavirus. Some of my thinking these days, and writing, and hopefully book writing, if it ever takes off, is with meaning and purpose. Generally. So we are at a time right now, we're creatures of comfort. We have, compared to the history of our species, we have things available to us that are making our lives incredibly convenient, easy, safe, advantageous, like you name it. We're in the best time ever. Let's put aside coronavirus for a second. Steven Pinker.
But coronavirus is kind of proving your point, right? Which is actually, if you think about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what's happening? We're all being pushed down, regardless of where we stand on the socioeconomic scale, we're being pushed down that. So I would almost say coronavirus is proving your point, is some of those things are being removed. People with wealth you can't isolate yourself. I mean, if you're incredibly wealthy, you can try, but you can't isolate yourself from it. And we're starting to see what's important and what matters. So I would argue it reinforces your point that ordinarily life for the average person, recognizing that some people are in extreme poverty and have some challenges, I don't want to belittle that. I think it's interesting. It sort of, to my mind, proves your point.
Yeah, good point. That's true. So given that we have all of these things available to us, and yes, there are the inequities, there are the people who are still struggling, but on average, because science is always on average and in general, and this is to Steven Pinker's point, we are the best we've ever been in human history on most all metrics and most KPIs. Despite that, okay, so that's sort of axiom number one. Number two, despite all of that, we are in a meaning crisis. We are seeing the highest rates of mental health, psychopathology, depression, anxiety disorders, mood disorders. Suicide is at its highest. People are, I believe, in the sort of midst of a meaning pandemic. Pardon the use of that word right now. But there is a mass scale drop off in meaning, both personal and collective meaning. Now, there's a number of reasons why that's the case. I think some of, it's multifarious. One of it is obviously technology use, social media, these things. But one of the driving forces in my own research and PhD and in some of the work I do now is the drop off in religion and religiosity. So religion, myth making, was by far the biggest source of meaning for humans for millennia. And we are right now, coinciding with all of the other movements that are happening, we're also the most atheistic we've ever been in human history since sort of like religion has been around. And so what I see happening is we as a species have said, like, we don't, these are sweeping generalizations to your listeners, so obviously I recognize that. But on large, we're saying we don't need this thing we call organized religion anymore. It's not doing what it did for us at one point in time. We're sort of a bit past that, let's say. And so now we have this hole. We are, and if there's anything, we are a meaning maintenance creature. We need meaning. And if we've sort of abandoned the main one that's been serving that need, that purpose for us for millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years, what do we have in its place? And I do believe that the one thing that should be in its place is work, is purposeful work. And I think how we design work for humans should be done through a human-centric approach, through a behavioral science-informed approach, so that we're getting people to, work in ways that is the most beneficial for them and for as many people as possible. And why not? We spend in our life, we do, well, I can't remember the percentage, but like of our waking hours, it's working. And so why not make that human activity the thing that fuels and feeds us and sustains us from a sense of like purpose and meaning? So that would be my BBB if I had to choose.
I love that. I love it for two reasons. One is it's a supremely positive way to end, which we always look for, as we know.
Yeah.
But the second bit is I think that's really interesting because we know intuitively that if you're doing a task you don't enjoy, that does not get the most out of you. And you might look like you've completed it, but we've all seen sort of shoddy workmanship. We've all been in meetings that we don't want to be in. We've all had to do things that don't bring out the best in us. And that is counterproductive. And I think what's interesting when technology is taking over a lot of the routine basic stuff, what does that leave for people? The answer is it's the stuff the machines can't do. And that requires us to be at our absolute best in terms of our cognitive abilities, in terms of our emotional engagement. And so I think that's a lovely vision that says we should start to think about building human-centric roles for people that take the best of what they're capable of. And the number of times, one of the interesting things about stepping out and working for myself is that I minimize the stuff that I'm bad at or don't want to do. And I minimize it by outsourcing it, or I just don't do it. Right. I don't go to silly meetings. I try and avoid speaking with people that I don't think will add value in my life or are going to bore me. And so there's a lovely thing there. Organizations destroy huge amounts of value because they get people to do things they are not good at. That's not necessary in some cases. Yeah. And so when I look at sort of, human risk versus human reward, you've come up with a lovely answer there that says, how do we get the most out of our human capital? And that's good from an economic perspective, but it's good from a societal perspective, makes us all feel a lot more valued and better. So it's also good from a mental health perspective.
Exactly. And it's win-win-win. Like we are, because of the gig economy, because of rapid technological innovation, because of automation, because of AI, like now is the time to actually do that so that we can focus on the work that is truly human. And so that's why I'm hopeful. Now, the whole like religion thing, that's like a debate that I love. And that's why that's going to be sort of, the book is going to be really about like the psychology of underlying meaning and what that means, what meaning means. But I think if we want to sort of, improve the outlook of our species moving forward, I think we have to sort of take a look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how do we create meaning for as the greatest number of people as possible? And that I'd say that what this does better than say religions is it's much less likely to be sort of divisive and parochial in nature, which is in a globalized society, at least in my opinion, is what we need more than ever.
Wow. On that note, firstly, thank you so much for your time on the podcast, because it's been really interesting and thought-provoking. And that for me is always the best thing, is forcing me to think is always a helpful thing. And I'm sure you've done exactly the same for my listeners. Thank you also for your podcast, because I think that adds hugely to the awareness and understanding of what's there. And I'll put links to that in the show notes, along with details of how to connect you. But for now, thank you so much for being on the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks, Christian. This was great. And it was great to be the person on the other end, answering the questions and not just asking. So really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk podcast. My enormous thanks to Nick Hobson for appearing, and to you for listening. If you're interested in hearing Nick's podcast, you'll find links to that in the show notes, together with some other resources that you might find of interest. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. If you had a moment to leave a review for the show on that platform, that would be hugely appreciated. It helps keep the profile of the show high, allows other people to find it, and me to continue to invite the kind of high quality guests I've managed thus far. Thank you so much for listening. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you very soon on this channel for what will be the 50th episode of the podcast. Thanks for listening.